What happens when a grandmother loses her job and her own family mocks her downfall, unaware that she secretly owns the company they depend on? Marjorie's next move shocked everyone. What happened next left the entire family in awe. Marjorie Wakefield had spent the better part of her life working hard, giving everything for her family. From early mornings as a young single mother hustling between jobs, to the late nights spent balancing household books, she had always been the one her children and grandchildren relied upon. Now, at 67, she should have been enjoying a quiet retirement, but Marjorie was not built for idleness. She still worked part-time at the same insurance office she had managed for over 2 decades. She liked the structure, the feeling of being useful, the steady hum of voices and telephones, and the small jokes exchanged over breakroom coffee. But change, Marjorie knew, was inevitable. And on a gray Monday morning in late November, it arrived like a cold slap. Her boss, a man young enough to be her son, whom she had trained herself, called her into his glass-walled office. He stumbled through a script about restructuring and new energy before sheepishly sliding a severance packet across the table. Marjorie sat there, stunned. She asked no questions. She simply nodded, accepted her fate, and quietly packed her things into a battered tote bag. The news traveled quickly through her family, thanks to her daughter-in-law Patricia's notorious love of gossip. That evening, Marjorie's children gathered at the old family house for Sunday dinner, as they had for years. She entered the living room, still in her work clothes, her face carefully composed. Patricia and Marjorie's eldest son, Gerald, were already there, sipping wine and scrolling their phones. Her youngest, Laura, breezed in late as usual, arms full of shopping bags. When Marjorie told them the news, her voice measured, lips barely quivering, she saw the flicker of surprise, quickly masked by sly smirks. Gerald barely hid a laugh, and Patricia's eyebrows shot up in a way that seemed almost gleeful. Laura offered only a cursory, "Oh, Mom, maybe it's time you relaxed anyway. You're not getting any younger." The conversation quickly shifted to vacation plans, luxury kitchen remodels, and Gerald's latest real estate deals. No one asked Marjorie what she planned to do next. No one thanked her for all the years she'd worked to provide for them, to keep the house standing, to send them to good schools. Instead, they laughed. Subtle at first, just snickers under their breath as Marjorie served the roast chicken, but it grew bolder as the wine flowed. Gerald made cracks about old dogs and new tricks, and Patricia openly wondered whether Marjorie had any savings left or if she'd need to move in with Laura now that she's free. Even Laura giggled, making snide jokes about coupon clipping and early bird specials. Marjorie sat at the head of the table, the same spot she'd occupied for 30 years, and listened. Her grandchildren, barely out of college, joined in, making light of the unemployed grandma meme. She felt something deep within her, an ache, yes, but also a fire. They didn't know. They didn't know what she had built, or the steps she had taken over the years when she'd seemed to be simply managing. They didn't know about the shares she had quietly acquired, the silent partnerships she had invested in, or the intricate web of trusts that bore her name. And above all, they had no idea that the very business they boasted about, Wakefield and Sons Logistics, was, on paper, hers. As the laughter grew, Marjorie quietly watched them, her eyes sharp behind her reading glasses. She heard every word, every dig, every dismissive giggle. She looked at her children and grandchildren, each one confident in their superiority, certain that their lives would only get easier now that she was out of the way. In that moment, she realized how little they truly saw her. She stood up to clear the plates, ignored their offers of help, which amounted to tossing napkins onto the floor and wandering off, and began to wash the dishes by hand, as she always did. But this time, she was thinking, plotting, remembering every document, every signed share, every small kindness she had shown over the years that had gone unreturned. When Gerald came into the kitchen, still chuckling, he patted her on the shoulder. "Don't worry, Mom. We'll take care of you. Just let us handle things from now on, okay?" Marjorie looked at him, a gentle smile on her face. "Of course, dear. I trust you." Inside, she was already setting things in motion. As the evening ended and the family drifted out into the night, Marjorie stood alone in the silent house, her mind racing. She pulled out a dusty box from a hall closet, a box filled with contracts, old letters, trust documents, and the kind of paperwork no one but her had bothered to read. The laughter still echoed in her ears, but it was no longer painful. It was fuel. Tomorrow, she decided, they would see exactly what she was made of. The morning after the disastrous family dinner, Marjorie woke before dawn, as she always had, but this time with a sharp sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. The sun was barely a blush behind the frost-laced windows, but Marjorie was already at her old oak desk in the study, sorting through the documents she had pulled from the closet. There were so many papers, old contracts, faded bank statements, yellowed share certificates, legal letters in crisp envelopes with embossed logos. Marjorie laid them out methodically, grouping them by year, then by entity. Her hands shook, but her mind was clear. Here, on these pages, was the secret life she had built while her children and their spouses dismissed her as a mere relic. She found the original stock certificates for Wakefield and Sons Logistics, the company her late husband had started from a single delivery van in the 1970s. After his passing, Gerald and Patricia had assumed they would inherit everything. What they never realized was that her husband had left Marjorie controlling shares in a blind trust, granting her the right to appoint or dismiss company leadership. There were also records of smaller investments, property, equipment, even a series of startups that, over the years, had been quietly absorbed by Wakefield and Sons. Marjorie's name was woven into the fine print. As Marjorie flipped through the contracts, she recalled the late-night meetings she'd attended in her husband's stead, the negotiations with lawyers, the careful conversations with bankers who treated her with respect, never suspecting she would one day be written off by her own kin. The phone rang mid-morning. It was Helen Finch, her old friend and one of the company's original board members. Helen still had a sharp mind and a quicker wit than any of Marjorie's children. Marjorie poured herself a cup of coffee and recounted what had happened at the dinner table. Helen snorted. "They don't have a clue, do they?" Marjorie smiled. "Not the faintest. I want to review the trust documents. And I'd like to know what Gerald's been doing with the books. I haven't had access to the accounts since he took over." Helen promised to help. They agreed to meet at a cafe the next morning, neutral ground, just in case Gerald or Patricia had spies in the company. The rest of the day, Marjorie played the role of the retired, defeated grandmother. She sent Laura a polite text, thanking her for the lovely dinner. She left a voicemail for Patricia, saying she'd be happy to look after the grandchildren while Patricia went to her spa appointment. Then she changed out of her apron, slipped into her best coat, and walked to the bus stop. Her destination, the city archives. Marjorie knew that true power was not only in what you owned, but in what you understood. She requested copies of every filing and deed with her name or Wakefield and Sons on it, digging through decades of paperwork until she found exactly what she was looking for: the document that confirmed her status as majority shareholder, the amendments giving her authority over the board, and, most surprising, a transfer of several key company assets to a holding company, one that Gerald had apparently forgotten about. Returning home late in the afternoon, Marjorie felt an energy she hadn't felt since her husband died. She was tired, yes, but determined. She made herself a cup of chamomile tea and spread the fresh copies across the dining table. When Laura stopped by that evening, Marjorie welcomed her warmly. "Come in, dear. I made your favorite shortbread." Laura, still smug from the night before, barely glanced at the papers before launching into stories about a yoga retreat and Gerald's plans to expand the business. Marjorie listened, nodding, while inside, she quietly tallied every lie. She realized her children had not only discounted her, they had underestimated her intelligence, her resolve, and her loyalty to the family name. As Laura left, Marjorie smiled and hugged her tightly, whispering, "You have no idea, my girl, how much I love you." Laura, puzzled, patted her hand and left in a whirl of perfume. That night, Marjorie called Helen again. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steady. "It's time they saw who's really at the head of this family." Helen's laughter sparkled through the receiver. "I've been waiting years for this, Marge. Let's show them." And so, as another night fell over the old Wakefield house, Marjorie put the final pieces in place. She no longer felt invisible. She was becoming the storm. Early the next morning, Marjorie dressed with a sense of quiet ceremony. She chose a crisp white blouse, a navy skirt, and her late husband's gold watch, a small, silent symbol of continuity. She glanced at herself in the mirror, noting the silver streaks in her hair, the lines on her face, the way her eyes seemed brighter than they had in years. Today was not a day for grieving lost respect, it was a day for reclaiming it. At the cafe, Helen was already waiting, stirring her coffee with impatience. They hugged warmly, their old camaraderie instantly revived. Helen had brought copies of the most recent financial statements and a slim blue folder containing the trust documents. Marjorie pored over them, nodding as Helen highlighted several transactions that seemed off. "Gerald's been paying himself bonuses out of an advisory fund," Helen explained, her tone clipped. "Patricia's drawn a salary as a consultant, for work I doubt she's ever done. The board has approved every move because Gerald's bullied the others into submission." Marjorie's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Helen placed her hand on Marjorie's. "The only reason they got away with it is because you let them. But you don't have to anymore." By noon, Marjorie was on her way to the company's main office, a modern glass building that Gerald had commissioned at great expense. As she walked in, the receptionist looked up in surprise. "Mrs. Wakefield, we haven't seen you in a while." Marjorie smiled warmly, and with a confidence she hadn't felt in years, asked for a visitor's pass. She walked through the familiar halls, past employees who still remembered her as the boss's wife, but had no idea she was much more. Gerald's office was at the end of the hall, ostentatious and sleek, filled with expensive leather and framed awards. He looked up, startled. "Mother, what are you doing here? Patricia and I have meetings all day." "I won't take much of your time," Marjorie interrupted, her tone even but icy. "I just need you to sign off on a few things. Standard paperwork." She held out a stack of innocuous-looking forms, annual declarations, minor board resolutions, things Gerald usually signed without reading. He flipped through them with little interest, his attention already back on his phone. "Sure, whatever. Just leave them with my assistant." Marjorie nodded and turned to leave. "Oh, Gerald, I'd like to attend the next board meeting." He blinked, caught off guard. "Of course. If you want. It's mostly routine business." Marjorie smiled. "Routine is good. I'll see you there." Later that afternoon, Helen called to confirm that Gerald had, in fact, signed exactly what Marjorie needed, a formal invitation for Marjorie to address the board, and, without realizing it, a proxy authorization that would let her vote not only her own shares, but the shares held in trust for her grandchildren. The days leading up to the board meeting were a whirlwind. Marjorie reviewed every document, made careful notes, and, at Helen's urging, scheduled a private consultation with a corporate lawyer. The lawyer was surprised to discover just how much control Marjorie truly held. "You understand, Mrs. Wakefield, that with this paperwork and these trusts, you can essentially override any board decision. You are, for all practical purposes, the company." Marjorie's lips twitched in a private smile. "That was the plan, yes." Meanwhile, Gerald and Patricia remained oblivious. Patricia spent her days shopping and posting filtered photos of luxury lunches, while Gerald made phone calls about a possible expansion into overseas markets. Neither noticed the subtle shift in office gossip, how staff began to stand when Marjorie entered a room, or how Helen started sitting in on more meetings, her notebook always open, her eyes sharp. The night before the board meeting, Marjorie sat in her study, reviewing her notes one last time. Her old cat, Molly, curled at her feet. The phone rang. It was Laura, sounding uncertain. "Mom, are you okay? Gerald says you've been around the office a lot." Marjorie kept her voice soft. "Just tying up some loose ends, dear. It's good to stay involved." Laura hesitated, then said, "If you need anything, let me know. I know Gerald and Patricia can be, well, you know." Marjorie felt a swell of emotion. "Thank you, Laura. That means more than you know." As midnight approached, Marjorie placed all her paperwork into a neat leather folder, laid out her best suit for the morning, and slipped into bed with a sense of certainty. Tomorrow, she would no longer be invisible. Tomorrow, she would walk into the boardroom and change everything. The day of the board meeting dawned crisp and clear. Marjorie arrived at the company headquarters earlier than anyone else, the leather folder clutched tightly beneath her arm. She paused in the marble foyer, taking a long breath, steadying herself, not just for a meeting, but for a confrontation decades in the making. Employees greeted her with deference. There was a murmured excitement, a sense that something unusual was about to happen. Helen met her at the elevator, her face split by a wide, conspiratorial grin. "Ready to take back your legacy," she whispered. Marjorie squeezed her hand, grateful for the steadying presence of her oldest ally. Inside the glass-walled boardroom, the directors gathered in their usual haphazard fashion, some early and nervous, others sauntering in late with coffee and bluster. Gerald sat at the head, exuding practiced arrogance. Patricia perched at his side, flicking through her phone, barely concealing her boredom. The meeting began with routine reports. Gerald droned on about projected revenues, expansion deals, and his vision for the future. Patricia presented a slide deck about branding initiatives, reading bullet points she clearly hadn't written herself. The board nodded politely, even as Helen caught Marjorie's eye and rolled hers. At last, Gerald reached the agenda item labeled Shareholder and Family Business. He paused, surprised to see it, and looked at Marjorie. "Mother, you asked to address the board?" Marjorie stood, her movements measured and dignified. She slid the leather folder onto the table, opened it, and began. "Thank you, Gerald. For 30 years, I have watched this company grow. I have seen its best days, and its worst. I have seen loyalty, and lately, I have seen neglect and disrespect." Gerald's face reddened, but he forced a smirk. "Mother, with all due respect." She raised a hand. "I'm not finished." The room fell silent. Calmly, Marjorie began reading from the trust documents and share certificates. She outlined, in careful detail, the path of ownership from her late husband's will to her own controlling stake. She referenced the proxy authorization Gerald had signed without reading, explaining, gently but firmly, that she now held majority voting power for both herself and the next generation. Helen distributed copies of the relevant documents to the stunned board members. Patricia let out a small gasp as she realized her consulting fees had not been so secret after all. Marjorie's tone never wavered. She listed the questionable advisory bonuses Gerald had paid himself and the unnecessary consulting expenses Patricia had claimed. She reminded everyone of the company's founding principles: hard work, accountability, and family, not entitlement and greed. Several directors shifted in their seats, suddenly attentive. The company's longtime legal counsel, Mr. Baines, asked, "Mrs. Wakefield, are you saying you are now the majority vote on this board?" Marjorie nodded. "That's correct. And as my first act, I am calling for a full audit of all financial activities for the past 5 years. Further, I propose we appoint an independent operations manager, one who understands our roots." Gerald shot to his feet, eyes wide. "You can't do this. I'm the CEO." Marjorie met his gaze. "You are, for now. But the board will decide, as it always has, by the majority vote. I am simply doing what is best for the company and for this family." Patricia, for once, had no words. The boardroom buzzed with whispers. Helen smiled quietly, watching as the tide turned. One by one, the directors reviewed the documents, murmured their assent, and nodded to Marjorie. The vote was swift. Marjorie's motions carried. The audit was approved, and a temporary freeze was placed on executive bonuses and consultant payments pending review. Gerald slumped in his chair, finally grasping the gravity of what had unfolded. Patricia sat rigid, her phone forgotten, her cheeks flushed. The meeting adjourned, and the boardroom slowly emptied, but Marjorie remained, basking in a sense of vindication and bittersweet relief. Helen hugged her tightly. "You did it, Marge. You really did it." Marjorie glanced out the window at the city below. For the first time in years, she saw a future, one shaped not by the expectations of others, but by her own quiet strength. She had entered the boardroom as a joke to her family. She left it as the owner of their future. Word of the boardroom upheaval spread through the family and the company like wildfire. By noon, Marjorie's phone buzzed with texts, calls, and emails. Some came from confused employees relieved by the promise of accountability. Others arrived from relatives stunned by her quiet power. Patricia was the first to react. She appeared at Marjorie's house that evening, all faux composure and brittle charm. "I'm sure there's been a misunderstanding, Marjorie. Gerald is so stressed. Can't we just keep things in the family?" Marjorie calmly set down her tea. "That's exactly what I intend to do, Patricia. I want our family to be strong, but that starts with honesty." Patricia blustered, offering apologies and excuses, but Marjorie's resolve held firm. Gerald, meanwhile, retreated into silence. He cancelled meetings, ignored emails, and avoided the house. Laura called Marjorie, voice tight with worry. "What did you do, Mom? Gerald says you embarrassed him. He's furious." Marjorie responded gently, "He needs time to understand. This isn't just about him. It's about protecting everything your father and I built." For days, the household simmered with tension. Gerald and Patricia sulked in their grand new home, snapping at each other, blaming everyone but themselves. Their children, Marjorie's grandchildren, grew uneasy. The oldest, Ben, texted Marjorie in secret. "Grandma, are you okay? I think Dad's in trouble. We miss you." Meanwhile, Marjorie moved quietly but decisively. With Helen's help and the board's support, she began interviewing candidates for the new operations manager, someone who shared her values of loyalty, humility, and hard work. Employees stopped her in the hallway to whisper thank you. Many had seen the waste and mismanagement, but no one had dared speak until now. Laura visited Marjorie more often, bearing homemade soup and concern. One evening, sitting at the kitchen table, she admitted, "I guess I never really understood how much you did for us, Mom. Gerald always said you'd left the company behind." Marjorie smiled. "Sometimes it's easier for people to believe a story that suits them. But Laura, I never stopped caring. I just waited until it mattered most." Even Gerald's youngest son, little Max, brought home a school drawing of Grandma at work and insisted Marjorie hang it on her fridge. These gestures, though small, reminded her of the deeper purpose behind her stand, not just pride or power, but legacy and love. Patricia tried to rally allies among the extended family, but the tide had turned. Old friends of Marjorie, neighbors, even distant cousins began to reach out, offering support and sharing stories about how Marjorie had helped them over the years. Her quiet generosity was remembered: college tuition paid for a niece, groceries bought for a struggling neighbor, jobs found for old friends. The Sunday dinner following the board meeting was a tense affair. Gerald arrived late, sullen, barely touching his food. Patricia avoided eye contact, Laura tried to keep the conversation light, and the grandchildren picked up on the underlying current. But Marjorie was gracious, asking about their days, praising their small successes, determined to show that her love was unchanged. When Gerald finally spoke, his words came out in a rush of hurt and confusion. "Why didn't you tell us, Mom? Why did you have to make a show of it?" Marjorie looked at him with a mix of sadness and resolve. "Because, Gerald, you laughed when I lost my job. You all did. You forgot who I was, and what I built. I hope, in time, you'll understand that I did this not to embarrass you, but to remind you, and all of us, what matters most." That night, after everyone had gone, Marjorie sat alone at the kitchen table, a gentle peace settling over her. She was not angry, she was relieved. The storm had shaken the roots of her family, but it had also cleared the air for something new to grow. Her journey was far from over. But for the first time in years, Marjorie felt wholly herself, not invisible, not a burden, but the matriarch, the builder, the owner of her family's legacy. The weeks that followed brought a new rhythm to the Wakefield family. The company was in transition, employees watched eagerly as changes began, and the board, guided by Marjorie's quiet authority, dove into the audit with clear-eyed determination. It was not easy. Each day revealed more evidence of Gerald's excesses and Patricia's self-dealing, but it also surfaced neglected opportunities and employees who had gone unrecognized for years. Marjorie spent her mornings in the office, reviewing reports with Helen and the newly appointed operations manager, Ms. Watson, a sharp, principled woman who remembered Marjorie from the company's early days. Ms. Watson immediately set about improving morale, reinstating family scholarships, offering training, and restoring the birthday traditions Marjorie's husband had started. For the first time in years, laughter and pride returned to the break room. At home, things were more complicated. Gerald still avoided his mother, ashamed and wounded by his loss of power. Patricia waged a silent campaign of resentment, slamming doors and making icy remarks at every chance. Laura became Marjorie's lifeline, stopping by for coffee, listening to old stories, and gently trying to coax Gerald out of his sulk. The grandchildren noticed the shift, too. Ben and Max invited Marjorie to school events, proudly introducing her as the boss. One afternoon, as autumn leaves began to fall, Marjorie decided it was time to reach out to Gerald directly. She invited him to lunch at a quiet, old-fashioned cafe, a place she'd taken him as a boy, back when he'd idolized her every move. Gerald arrived late, tense, refusing dessert. He stared at his coffee, fidgeting with the sugar packets. "I don't know how to talk to you anymore, Mom. Everything's changed." Marjorie reached across the table, her hand warm and steady. "It has changed. But it had to. Gerald, I let you run with things because I trusted you. But trust isn't blind, and it isn't a blank check. I want you to be part of the company, but you have to earn that place, just like everyone else." He bristled, then slumped. "You make it sound so simple." "It's not," she said, her voice gentle. "It never was. But you're still my son. This company is your legacy too, if you can accept that it's about more than titles and perks." Gerald nodded, the anger draining from his face, replaced by uncertainty and, finally, a hint of humility. "What do you want me to do?" "Start with the audit. Work with Ms. Watson and Helen. Listen to the people you used to ignore. Show them who you can be." The conversation was a turning point. It didn't fix everything overnight, but it broke the ice. Gerald agreed to shadow Ms. Watson, to listen and learn. He even apologized to several employees he'd wronged, awkward, yes, but heartfelt. At the next Sunday dinner, the mood was lighter. Patricia, still sullen, joined only out of habit, but Laura and the grandchildren filled the house with stories and laughter. Marjorie watched as Gerald and Ben argued over a board game, their old camaraderie slowly returning. Marjorie's pride wasn't in her victory, but in the repair. Seeing her son begin to grow again, seeing her family begin to heal, witnessing the company she'd nurtured come back to life. That evening, after everyone had gone, Marjorie sat by the window, Molly purring in her lap, and wrote in her journal, "Real power isn't holding on. It's letting go and watching what you've built take root in others. I wanted respect, but I found something greater, restoration." She smiled, knowing there were still storms to weather, but confident that this time, her family, and her legacy, would survive. As autumn settled and the days grew shorter, the Wakefield family's landscape continued to shift. The company, energized by Ms. Watson's reforms and Marjorie's steady hand, began to post its first growth in years. Employees took pride in their work again, and the board meetings, once tense and performative, became productive sessions where ideas and feedback were genuinely welcomed. Marjorie made a point to listen to the quietest voices in the room, remembering her own years of invisibility. Gerald, for his part, faced the consequences of his mismanagement but also embraced the opportunity for redemption. He threw himself into the audit, working side by side with Helen and Ms. Watson, learning the day-to-day operations he'd long neglected. At first, his efforts were awkward, but as the weeks passed, he regained the respect of colleagues who once whispered about his entitlement. Slowly, he earned back the trust of the staff and, more importantly, his mother. Patricia, however, clung to her bitterness. She distanced herself from the company and from family events, nursing her wounds in private. Her absence was felt, but Marjorie did not chase her. Some lessons, she knew, required solitude and time. Laura remained a bright presence in Marjorie's life, her frequent visits a balm during uncertain times. She helped Marjorie host impromptu family dinners, inviting cousins and neighbors, reviving the warmth that had always been the heart of the Wakefield home. Even Ben and Max brought friends, eager to share stories about their grandma, the boss. One evening, Marjorie sat on the porch with Laura, a blanket draped over their laps. The leaves rustled in the chilly wind, and the porch light cast a golden glow on their faces. Laura reached over and squeezed her mother's hand. "You know, Mom, I never realized how much you held us together. Not just the company, but everything. I'm proud of you." Marjorie blinked back tears, her heart swelling with both grief and gratitude. "I did it for all of you, Laura. But I also did it for myself. I wanted to prove that no matter what life takes away, you can always build again, from nothing if you have to." As Thanksgiving approached, Marjorie decided it was time for a true family celebration. She invited everyone, Gerald, Patricia, Laura, the grandchildren, even Helen and Ms. Watson, to a feast at the old Wakefield house. She prepared the meal herself, with Laura and Lily chopping vegetables, Max rolling dough for pies, and Ben setting the table with the fine china. When everyone arrived, the air was charged with emotion. Gerald and Patricia entered quietly, and for a moment, the old wounds hovered in the doorway. But Marjorie greeted them with open arms, showing no trace of resentment. Instead, she thanked Gerald for his hard work and told Patricia she hoped to see more of her at family gatherings. As the family sat around the long table, Marjorie offered a toast. To family, messy, stubborn, sometimes foolish, but always worth fighting for. I lost my job, but I never lost hope. And thanks to all of you, I found something far more valuable, the chance to start again. The table erupted in cheers and laughter. For the first time in years, Marjorie felt whole, a matriarch not just in name, but in spirit, surrounded by a family and a company, rising strong on a new foundation. That night, as the house fell quiet, Marjorie wrote a letter to her late husband, tucking it into a keepsake box. We nearly lost everything, but I remembered what you taught me. Never give up on family, and never let anyone tell you you're finished. Our story isn't over. It's just getting good. Winter came early that year, dusting the Wakefield house in shimmering white and filling the office windows with the glow of holiday lights. Marjorie watched the snow swirl from her favorite chair, Molly the cat purring in her lap, her thoughts stretching across the long, winding road she had traveled to this moment. The company, once teetering on the edge of complacency and mismanagement, now thrived. Ms. Watson's reforms bore fruit, profits rose, employee turnover dropped, and Wakefield & Sons earned a reputation for fairness and loyalty, echoes of its earliest days. Helen was honored at the annual company banquet for her years of service, and even Gerald took the stage to publicly thank his mother for reminding us all where true strength comes from. Gerald, now humbled and wiser, found a new place in the business, not as a ruler, but as a steward and partner. He worked late, listened to staff, and became the kind of leader Marjorie had hoped he could be. He brought Ben and Max into the office during school breaks, teaching them not just numbers, but integrity. Patricia, though still distant, slowly thawed. She sent Marjorie a handwritten note at Christmas, thanking her for taking care of all of us, even when we didn't deserve it. Laura, meanwhile, became an indispensable source of support, her laughter and warmth a constant reminder that family, at its best, was about forgiveness and showing up again and again. The holidays were brighter than Marjorie could remember in years. She hosted a festive dinner, inviting not just family, but Helen, Ms. Watson, and several longtime employees who had become like kin. The Wakefield home, alive with voices and music, sparkled with new hope. After dessert, Ben led a toast, to Grandma, for being the real boss, not just of the company, but of our hearts. As laughter and clinking glasses filled the room, Marjorie smiled, her eyes glistening. She thought of the day she'd lost her job, the humiliation and anger, the laughter of those she loved. What had started as pain had become the very fuel that forced her to reclaim her worth, not for revenge, but for restoration. Later that night, Marjorie slipped into her study. She pulled out her journal and wrote, "I was invisible, until I wasn't. Power is not in what you own, but in what you build, protect and pass on. The true legacy isn't a company, or money, or property. It's resilience. It's courage. It's teaching those you love that you are never, ever finished, unless you choose to be." She closed the book with satisfaction. Her family had changed. The company had changed. And she, Marjorie Wakefield, had changed most of all. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying the promise of a new year. Inside, Marjorie knew that whatever storms might come, her family's foundation was strong. And this time, no one would ever laugh at her again.